Welcome aboard the Workplace Whiz, your audio gateway to the modern workplace. We designed this podcast as the place to discuss strategies, best practices, and share industry insights with our expert guests. This program is brought to you by Yarums, the workplace experience platform. I'm Cosmin Patlageanu, marketing professional and published author. Today we are discussing accessibility and the hybrid workplace challenges. With me today I have Chris Morett. Chris has taught at several universities and served as an administrator helping to plan and manage campus spaces. As a consultant, he has worked with organizations in and academia and elsewhere to bring a pragmatic data-informed approach to helping them get the most out of the space. Chris received his PhD in sociology and master's in public policy, where he concentrated in work organizations, workplace flexibility policies, and how workplace culture promotes or hinders the usage of flexibility policies. He is now the president of Cohere Campus and Workplace. Once again, Chris, welcome to the podcast. Just to set the stage for our conversation a little bit, in today's evolving work environment, hybrid work has become the norm for many organizations. And while the model offers flexibility and convenience, it also presents some new challenges, particularly around accessibility. And as more employees split their time between the physical and virtual spaces, then the risk of accessibility issues has grown, particularly for those with invisible disabilities and chronic conditions. And in this episode, we explore how organizations can address these challenges head-on, ensuring that every employee, regardless of their abilities, has an equal opportunity to thrive. And from optimizing the physical workspaces to leveraging and using the new and emerging technologies, we'll dive into the strategies that can enhance accessibility, foster inclusion, and make hybrid work truly equitable for all. And just to highlight some of the stats, 10% of Americans today are estimated to have an invisible disability. 54% of Americans aged 18 to 34 are estimated to have at least one chronic condition, and 22% had more than one. And this actually is higher among the older workers. So the first thing I wanted to ask you is, what are the invisible disabilities and how can they impact employees' experience in the workplace?
And I'll just say that to the numbers you mentioned, if you talk to different people, they might come in with slightly different numbers. It depends on how you define chronic condition. It depends on how you define invisible. But even if somebody were to say, I'd go lower, I'd go higher, it's a significant subset of employees. And, certainly, even if it was one, you would want to address it, but it's enough where the impact on the bottom line is there. Chronic conditions, invisible disabilities could include anything from, visual or auditory conditions that people may not report. They might be slight enough where maybe you don't notice them visibly having trouble or squinting or something like that. Could be chronic pain. There's a lot of that. It could be somebody with maybe early stage multiple sclerosis or Parkinson's that is not detectable or is so subtle that they hide it, as we know people often do. There's often perceived to be not a benefit to divulging that you've got a physical condition, and we may think that's wrong, but that's the reality in many cases. Another example could be folks who are on the neurodivergent on the autism spectrum, who might have different experiences with sound level and other aspects of the physical environment. So it's really it's a very wide range of conditions that can be easy to forget if you're not personally experiencing them.
Absolutely. And I was just thinking about the term invisible, right? Because to some extent, obviously they're invisible because you're not particularly showing some sort of disability, because many of us probably associate a disability with something which is rather obvious, right? But chronic pain is not. You can't really see it. So, yeah. In what ways has hybrid work heightened the risk of accessibility issues?
Sure. I'll say very quickly that, I am a fan of hybrid work, of course, and remote work can help, let's say, people who can't get out of their house. But if we're actually talking hybrid, where people are going into a physical location on occasion, to me, there are two or three things that create this risk. One is, and this assumes hoteling. All this assumes that you're not sitting at your own desk anymore. That's really the crux of the issue. Once you start changing around, you are exposed to more environments. So just statistically, there's a higher chance that one of them will not match with what your needs or preferences are. And to the extent that you don't have predictability of those environments, or you don't have full choice, maybe there's a couple workspaces that work for you in your office, but you don't always get to reserve them. Maybe there's only a few of them. Maybe there's more people who need a quiet space or a cold or a hot space than there are spaces. Then that's where you can start to run into issues. And then also in the hybrid workplace, to the extent we're having more all hands meetings, magnet days, whether it's monthly or quarterly, those can entail going to spaces the person is very unfamiliar with. Maybe they're more off sites, and they've always happened, but I think they're more prominent in the hybrid work era. Maybe they're in a different city, and you're often doing things on those days that are unpredictable. And it's that unpredictability uh, with the lack of information or power or time to choose what situation you're in that creates just this heightened risk of people experiencing situations that don't work for them. Maybe they can't participate. Maybe they're just uncomfortable. Maybe they're not doing their best. And so it's, the last thing I'll say, it's obviously not a pleasant experience for the person, but also it can affect the team and the company. If let's say we were at some session, we were supposed to be brainstorming in a big room and maybe we couldn't hear well or something, or weren't comfortable writing on the fly, whether that's the way our mind works, or maybe we had dyslexia and we didn't want to write down something that was misspelled. Not that anybody should feel shame around that, but they often do. Then we're not contributing to the company in the way that we could if just some small accommodations or tweaks were made.
Absolutely. So, do you think this is? I mean, obviously, some of the consequences are obvious, right? Discomfort here and there, the inability to participate properly to the conversation. How do we mitigate this? I mean, given the fact that this situation can occur, and me, I'll take myself as an example. Let's say I have dyslexia also. If I say beforehand, I'm in this particular position, I want to participate, I want to contribute. How can we arrange things so I'm comfortable with the situation? Is communication the way forward?
I guess I'll put it into two buckets, at least for now. One is making employees feel comfortable disclosing their needs and preferences. Now, somebody may say that's not the goal. The goal is to make the environments so universally designed and welcoming to all that they accommodate everybody. But I think that's almost impossible, right? Because there are certain environments that one person may prefer and the other one may not. So as much as we should think about design that works for everybody, we're making a document available in hard copy and electronically, you're never going to hit perfection, and perfection is probably just a fictional idea. So yes, I'm talking to the person who would be skeptical of this comment. You do need to promote and facilitate and really go over the top in making people feel comfortable communicating their needs. And maybe there's some confidentiality. Another thing you can do is to provide choice. So you don't need to tell anybody, but if there's multiple options, let's say for you to participate in a group conversation, maybe there are different rooms, then you can pick. And then the last thing I think I would say is that, which I sort of just implied, is any given situation, the design of the room and so forth should be mindful of the fact that there are a lot of different people out there, and a lot of times the design of rooms and other things, clothes, hospital beds, is for like a 6 foot tall white male like me, and maybe like you're sitting. So, and there just needs to be a broader perspective. But I think that just saying we need to design good rooms, misses the point, because it's about the activity that happens in the room. And it's about the fact that no, design process, as inclusive as it is going to accommodate everybody's need at all times. So there's got to be this sort of scheduling, informational, transparency and control piece that you try to give to the employees. And I think the hard part, the last thing I'll say for companies is that, if you're sort of a mid manager, hey, go plan this offsite, make it great, book the hotel, book travel, and by the way, don't forget about the different sensory preferences of the 300 people who are going to be there. Uh, it's a bit much. And that's what I try to do, is just to bring in a little extra insight for the people who have just so much on their plate.
Absolutely. So for sure, there isn't like one size fits all, right? And no matter how mindful you are when designing a space, still you have limitations. And we were just talking on another episode about preferences and data. And I gave you my example because I had my office was half of a bigger office, but they built a wall, right? And in the other office, there were the ladies from recruitment. And my office was hotter than theirs. I had a big wall on the west side. So it was a glass wall. So it turned really hot. And I obviously turned the air conditioning on a lower setting, but they were freezing. So, even though we didn't have any special requests, there was a discomfort anyhow, either for me, either for them, right? So take that as a probably very simple thing, right? And eventually we found the workaround. But still, this is something that kind of annoys you. The situations we're talking about when the preferences are not just because I like it warmer or colder, is because I can't really be part of the conversation as I should. So that's not a thing of personal preference. I like it like that. It's because I want to be part of it. And I understand why people wouldn't be that, I don't know, they wouldn't be disclosing, or they wouldn't want to disclose some of the things. But I think that's the first step. And I'm sure that in most of the cases, they can count on the discretion of the managers, right? So not everybody needs to know. It's probably one of those need to know bases, right? But you can, as a manager, I think it's kind of your job to make sure that your team can provide the best work. And if there are some limitations that you need to overcome for some people, you need to overcome them. Because in the end, your output as a manager is the output of your team. If you can't accommodate, then I don't know how good of a manager you are, right? So you need to be mindful of them. Maybe I was too blunt, but still, I mean, that's kind of the way I see things. And then again, when we're talking about events, so that's an entirely different situation, because where you go needs to be kind of screened before, so you make sure that everybody can get there properly. I mean, you won't pick, the base camp if you have people who are, have trouble breathing, of course, right? So then, it's just, I think it's not even going extra mile. It's just making sure that you understand the needs of everybody on the team. And looking at the numbers, I mean, they are worrying, really, because if you're looking at 10% of the people have some sort of invisible disability, then it's not something that's very rare, right? It's something that you kind of need to accommodate. When you design workplaces, I think that's a little bit different and hard to actually make sure that you cover all the bases. But when you as a company get a space where your team is going to work from, then you need to do some adjustments, of course.
Yeah. And maybe the activity, right? It's really the space in conjunction with the activity and the technology and the people. Maybe you are on a team where you feel comfortable, where the people are just accommodating or good at trying to structure the activity to accommodate people, let's say, who are faster or slower. For example, where you get put into an environment where maybe if it's an all hands meetings, you don't know the other people very well, and I'm not going to tell Mary from Chicago about my hear. I personally can't hear out of one ear, and I do tell everybody, but I used to not, and it would depend who it was. So there's so many variables that I think what you're saying is really true. That it's such a moving target that constant attention has to be paid to it, and you can't just say, well, hey, we got this space and it has these characteristics and it's going to help. And I also think starting to go down this road, I like to talk about this and say, hey, this is an opportunity to make sure everybody can do their best. And a lot of times it's not necessarily this high cost thing. It's just giving a little thought, um, including more perspectives in the design of the event. But could it affect recruitment and retention? Um, and then you start to talk about real inconvenience and cost to the company. Oh,
Absolutely. And when we think about the workplace in this hybrid scenario, the part from home, obviously, or the remote part, you design it and you kind of model it to your needs, right? How about the physical space from the office, so the one provided by the company? How can organizations optimize that space to ensure accessibility?
I think there are certain types of design that we'll say that are better than others. Certain sins you don't want to commit as a designer. Uh, whether it's as the architect, the interior designer, etc., the workplace manager, and but then and that includes some kinds of lighting are just bad. They're bad for everybody. But then you get into within a single space. To me, the what you want to do is choice, and whether that's an adjustable desk or a certain kind of chair, maybe multiple chairs. Maybe you uh, have the chair that's in the room, but then you have a bullpen of other chair types for somebody who wants a stool or a hard back, and who knows what their needs may be. But then also, I think it's choice among rooms. Some rooms are just brighter than others. Some rooms are hotter or colder. Um, so I think it really is about that choice and that scheduling, and then again the transparency and the freedom for somebody to go in and say, well, I think this space is better for me, or um, I can tweak this space and it will be better. Maybe it's multiple kinds of lighting. Um, so on one hand, it's simple to say, but to execute it, I think at the office level, um, is something that often falls through the cracks, because there are just so many. If you sort of look at the number of people out there, the number of situations or experiences or activities, and the types of technology, the people they could be working with, and what's your deadline? Maybe something's fine if I have 5 days to finish the project. I don't quite work as fast, and it's not pleasant, but I get it done. But it's like, here, we have this thing, and we have to turn this proposal over by tomorrow. We have to all be on all cylinders. That's where you have this mix of situations that uh, makes this a tricky topic.
Absolutely. And I was just thinking that this has to be difficult for the designers and for facilities as well, because they need to take into account all kinds of moving parts. But if it starts from the leadership and from the management teams, and they are transparent about it, and first of all, if they are aware of this, and then they foster this transparency, I think it kind of bubbles down in a good way through the teams, and you can of course avoid that those difficult situations. Obviously, when the deadline is so tight, then probably there is no way around it. So yeah, all cylinders fired up. But speaking of leadership and management, how can they foster this awareness and empathy around actually the invisible disabilities in the workplace without actually bringing people in front of the class, let's say, and
Yeah, yeah,
giving
yeah.
them as an example, because that would be even more awkward, right? So what's
Yeah.
the best way to go?
And it is difficult, if you could go back, that not even though the American, looking at the American context, but this would be true of Europe too. I mean, it's been a long time since there was a legislation to require equal access to facilities, and that legislation is not perfect, but that topic has been in the air for a long time. But it's still, you know, people with disabilities, chronic conditions. I would say even certainly in my memory, and in the memory of people who are younger than me, was stigmatized, and maybe still is to some extent. You're seen as sick or less able, and a lot of conditions, maybe, for example, get um, confused with or conflated with an intellectual disability when they're not. And if they were, that's also okay. So I think my point is there's so much pushing against a comfort level that even small steps by leadership can be really impactful. And I think talking about it is a big deal. Talking about it is a big deal in a way that's very straightforward, that's not clearly uncomfortable, um, and that may take practice, but sort of just folding it in and making it normal. And part of it, I think, if to jump to the other end of the process, is we just want to make our environments good for everybody, of course, right? I mean, bad design also hinders people who we wouldn't classify as having a disability or a different ability. So I think if it's just part of that talking and part of that, sort of approach is to stop implying or assuming that we don't have to pay attention to the fit between people, experiences, and spaces for everybody. And to me, in that broader mindset, it makes it easier to talk about people who might have what we're now classifying as a different need, right? Like a qualitatively different need, that they're in this category called invisibly disabled, um, and to sort of normalize it.
Great insights, and yeah, I do think it kind of takes practice. Um, but then again, it's like a vicious circle. If you don't know, you can't actually do anything about it, right? So I think it needs to start with the level of confidence of people sharing the specific needs that they have, right?
Yeah.
Because
Well,
otherwise,
sorry, go ahead.
yeah, otherwise I can't really tell, right? So actually the tricky part, and I understand why people wouldn't be forthcoming about that. But then again, just taking a leap of faith and sharing that, it's the foundation of getting things better. Because otherwise you just assume, you have a medium access level, or I don't know how to call it. It's like a pretty good design for everyone, but this is assuming that everyone is, doesn't have any specific or special requirements. So I do
Yeah.
think it's a thing of trust, which probably comes, along the way. You can't assume it from the very beginning. And then there is probably, um, I'm thinking, is probably much more uh, familiar in bigger companies, in bigger organizations, right? Because if it's a game of numbers, then they would have encountered these situations many times, um, rather than a startup, let's say, where they have like 10 or 15 people. So they might or they might not have that sort of situation. They might not be aware even, right?
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
didn't mention the legislation, which is obviously it's kind of the same everywhere, but the way it's applied or the way it's respected, that differs, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, to go back really quickly to the previous question, that I'll comment on what you just said, is if you're a leader at a company, of the whole company or of a unit, it is uncomfortable. It can be uncomfortable to talk about, conditions that others may have. I know for myself, what if I use the wrong word? What if I say something that is just, unintentionally ignorant? Um, and where and that includes talking about diversity and equity and inclusion. And I think what you have to do, in my opinion, is just say it, engage with the topic, and you might say something that makes you, um, I don't know, seem out of touch, or but I think if you do it with the right heart, um, then first of all, we have to do it, and if you do it with the right heart, people will work with you. And if we can't risk, if you're the leader of a company, leadership is about taking risks to help others. So just say it. You're not sure what the right word is. Disability, differential ability. I used to try to avoid using the word disability, and people were just confused. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to use the word disability. I thought I was like ahead of the curve, right? And trying to expunge that word from my lexicon. So I think, accept the lack of comfort. But the other thing we were saying about yeah. So I think that's what I would say about leadership. And then for other people, in terms of how do you communicate your needs, one thing I would suggest to a client would be not necessarily to say, hey, what condition do you have, but make it more about what environment do you prefer. So that's probably more comfortable and more to the point, because I don't care what condition you have, I care what you need. Whether it's
Absolutely, yeah.
it's chronic pain or something else. I care about the person, but I care what they need. And that's probably a more comfortable conversation.
That's a fantastic point, and I was just thinking, when we were working on the questions for the podcast, I was a bit afraid, of the wordings really, and I apologize in advance if I misuse some of the words. English is not my first language, and I was like, what if I say something that offends people? Obviously unintentionally, uh, but yeah. So if that happens, I will apologize again if needed. But the whole point was actually making sure that these conversations bubble up in some way, and I think that's a fantastic way to put it, right? So eventually, nobody cares about the condition itself. It's like I want to give you the environment, provide you with the environment that actually allows you to do your best work, and just tell me what that is, so I can
Yeah.
accommodate eventually. So yeah, that's
And when you
probably
talk about,
the most positive way to.
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was thinking that's a very positive way to frame the conversation.
Yeah. And I think I'm always afraid that I'm going to appear glib when I talk about these things, because you do have to lay out suggestions and ideas and practices, because that day is going to come and that meeting is going to start. But there's a lot of debate and difference of opinion and a lot of nuance. And so, how do you discuss it in a way that is pragmatic and that allows us to progress, but that also doesn't sort of gloss over all this all this complexity? And again, for a lot of folks with disabilities, because of the inherent condition or because of the social experience, that's very painful, um, and it's a constant struggle. What if somebody with severe depression, right? I mean, that's just a constant thing they have to fight against. And then here I am talking about how we can help them out, or accommodate, or not violate their needs as an end user. But so it can be hard to talk about, and that's a preface to say that, to follow up on your point, when you think about making sure everybody is comfortable, maybe it's not this big complicated political thing. Maybe it's like a party. If you had a party, a small party at your house, and this is going back, this could go back years before all these topics were in the air. You'd say, does everybody have something to eat? You'd go to every guest. Do you have, is there something here for you to eat? Right? Whether they were, and no, people weren't talking about gluten free or even vegetarian 20 years ago, vegan or this or that. But no, you're just the host of a party. Are you comfortable? Can I get you anything? And you can't quite do it that person to person at a corporate event that's got more than 10 people. But just that mentality, it's not hard. Like, are your guests comfortable? And I think if we kind of look at it like that, and yeah, the technical aspect is harder than a dinner party for 10, but maybe that's how we can look at it, to stop worrying so much about, are we getting it perfect? Are we using the wrong word? What about, what if some of these people don't have a writing surface that works for them? I mean, that's a problem, but just approach it like a party host. And because I think fear and um, discomfort at some point work against finding a solution.
I love the analogy with the party, and that I guess that's spot on, right? Because whenever I mean, I'll give you my example. If I'm organizing a barbecue at my house, then I just go quickly through the list. There wouldn't be many, right? Don't have like big of a house, but still, is everybody enjoying, I don't know, the sort of meat that I'm buying, or do I need also to get some vegetables because some of them wouldn't? So if we keep the analogy, then I think, yeah, the first steps are already done. But you mentioned at some point something about technology, and I was about to ask you, what role does technology play in all this?
Well, I think one point I would, we've, this has been, you've asked so many good questions and we've hit a lot of the topics, but I think if I had to sort of name a couple main points, one really is it's not just about the design of the room, it's about the scheduling of the activity or the person into the room. How does that happen? What's the choice? What's the transparency, and so forth? So one, as you know, the mechanism you use to select your spaces um, is really important. Does it facilitate transparency into the spaces? Um, that's sort of a meta level thing, I guess, but also technology. Let's say it comes to the technology in the room. Um, I'm thinking of screens and monitors. Uh, are they accessible? Assistive technology, right? There are systems to help people who are hearing impaired to hear better in the room? Are your PowerPoint slides legible from the back row? Um, we were taught to not read our PowerPoint slides growing up, but best practice for disabilities is to read your slides, um, which just means you have to have shorter slides, which is good, right? But that's the intention. Don't read your slides. You do never read your slides. Until like 2 years ago, that's what I would say. Now I'm like, oh no. I mean, what if there's somebody there who can't? Uh, then maybe you should, or at least hand out a copy in advance. So I'm not saying it must be the reading of the slide, but you have to think: is there someone in the room that can't do it? Or again, make the font really big so you're at least reducing the likelihood that somebody experiences this issue. And then finally with technology, then there's all the remote technology and you know your systems you have as a company, whether they're proprietary, whether it's your instance of Microsoft Word, uh, etc., and the computers you give out, and whether they're in the office or whether they're given to people at home. Um, those are all aspects I think that are really important. And it's not just the technology, right? Let's say Teams, and I haven't done like a accessibility audit of Teams. I'm sure it's very good, but you have 88 different like threads in Teams, let's say, or whatever other platform. Not at all picking on Teams. What's the experience of somebody with, let's say, some cognitive processing issue to have all these threads and dings and reminders? I don't know the answer. I just know the question, which is how is it affecting people? So those are some of the ways that, technology really matters. And I think the last thing I'll say, and this is just a pitch I use in my space, sort of space planning, space activation consulting, is the people who are in charge of the physical space must be in touch with the people in charge of technology. And they often are not. You need to be having lunch once a week. You need to be chatting. What's new? What conference did you just go to? It's a unified experience from the end user's perspective. And all too often, technology and space are just ships in the night. Maybe the AV person who's going to hang the screen talks to the architect for 2 minutes to tell them where they need their data and electric pulled. But it's a huge opportunity for improvement going forward.
That's a great insight. And I was just thinking now that, during the pandemic, at least, many all of a sudden had to organize some sort of a setup at home, right,
Yeah.
for their remote work. How can companies, I mean, given the hybrid work content, basically many of them are still working in a hybrid work system or setup. How can they make sure that people have at home in their remote work setup everything they need?
Yeah. So I would start by saying that's a tricky issue. And I think it's still being legally worked out. What is the company responsible for? What if the person gets hurt at home while working? Um, and what count as work hours, right? I'm going to do a little email at 11 p.m. Which is a sad reality for many of us. So there's this legal aspect that I would just mention, but I think the way I would view it would be to look at it as an opportunity. And I think companies, especially as you have employees who have choice in how in where they work, right? The seat they sit in and so forth, but also how they work. And this is true of people in office too. What's the timing of when you do things? What order do you do tasks in? There's so much variability there. We're not just on an assembly line. And so that really raises the issue of performance, like, and cognition. And, should you chunk your tasks? When should you take breaks? Uh, it's just, and, of all these productivity books that come out now, like Atomic Habits, or another book that I'm forgetting the name of and the author, and so it's like, what if we just had as an idea helping people work in ways that maximize their performance and well-being? And now that's a that's complicated, but I think doable, especially for a company that has an evolved HR function, right? Or can bring in a consultant who can say, listen, here's a little, 10-minute thing on helping people think about the best way to work. So at least we maybe don't reach perfection. Not everybody's going to read Atomic Habits. Uh, Not that I'm being paid to mention that book twice. I haven't even read it. I just know of it. But one of these days I'll read it. But, it's like, can we just help people think about their work style? And I think that just then maps back to, what's your physical setup at home that's going to make you the most comfortable? What's the role of sitting, standing, moving, resting? Um, so then I guess the simpler answer would be, you know, teach people about ergonomics, um, reminders about slumping. And I know there are some programs out there that will ping you and say, you've been working for a while, maybe you should stand up. So it's
So
a
just
huge topic.
it is indeed, and I just remember. So back in the day, we used to have Blackberries, the terminals before the iPhone and everything became so popular. And we had this colleague on the sales team, and he was always on his BlackBerry. And uh, we called him a zombie because he was just obliviously walking, down the corridor. And he was just on his BlackBerry. He was always using it instead of using the computer. It's like super proficient at writing on it. I eventually did the same, but the problem was you were always something, right? And humpback. So it was like, that's a BlackBerry posture. And then when Facebook appeared and they had that logo, it was like, yeah, because everybody's on their phones like that. And but that's a issue. I mean, I have it too, and I'm pretty much convinced that everybody using a desk or a phone more than they're supposed to have the same back problems. So it's probably generational wide, right? So what I do, I go to the gym to compensate for that. I try to get up every once in a while. I go cycling. I do all sorts of things just to balance out or even out the time I'm spending in a bad position eventually, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was just thinking, when you are with somebody else, they'll just hit you in your back, say, "Yo, straight on your back," right? But if you're at home, in your remote work setup, there is no one to tell you, you're just sit like that. It's not healthy, right?
Yeah.
So many things we don't account for happen. I mean, as much as you try to have your remote work set up perfect, it's never gonna be perfect. I mean,
Yeah.
even if you get the best chair in the world, if you just sit like that, then that's the way you're gonna sit. So I was eventually thinking that this approach should be like a cultural thing in the organization. And I know many of them have that inclusion thingy on their in their tagline, saying, yeah, we're home for everyone, we do everything for everybody, which is obviously impossible for the reasons you mentioned earlier. We can only strive to get as close as possible. But if this is a cultural thinking, and I would encourage people to have these conversations, just to have it as a core value, if you like. So inclusion is eventually about not about talking about it, but just doing stuff that heads in the right direction. Um, is there a way we can use the latest tech like AI and the smart things that we play with on a daily basis to foster this communication eventually, to make things better for people?
Yeah. Well, I think when you're talking in the context of a building, so when they're in the office, there's so much now with AI, and that can include sensing occupancy patterns and knowing what to do with the temperature of the room. Um, I'll leave that as the example. It's gonna shift so rapidly. I was gonna say, you can also start to understand where people are sitting, and where different kinds of people are sitting to get some intelligence about how they like the spaces. I mean, you could do that without AI or IoT, but that just makes it a lot easier to do at scale. Um, so I think neither of those will be a magic bullet, but they will, I think, allow some things to happen. To me, and I really just shouldn't say this because I'll just look dumb like in 6 months, but a lot of it is part of it is allowing things to happen at scale that maybe you could do if you had 10 people in your office, but not if you have 1,000 or 500 or more. Um, and I think it also gets us another thing too, and this is true of any sort of data effort, is it just gets us thinking, right? So, okay, we have the Internet of Things now. We can measure behavior. We can analyze data. Okay, well, then what concepts are we talking about? What outcomes do we care about? What variables? Let's define physical health. How do we define good posture? What's good posture? And for how many minutes of the hour do you have to have good posture to be like in the green zone? And once we have the capacity to measure these things, including AI and IoT fueled tools, then we're forced into defining concepts, which is its own game. So I would also really call that out as something that, you know, is a benefit of these systems, even if we're not sure exactly how they're going to look in 6 months from now.
Yeah, for sure. Because I was just thinking, the pace of this, all the technologies that they evolved was on such a rapid pace. When I first started playing with GPT, it wasn't that mind blowing, but still was really good, right? But now, I mean, 6 months later, it's like amazing.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about ways to actually include the feedback, or maybe not include, but create like a feedback loop based on the data that you mentioned, right? So you can have sensors telling you which areas are occupied by whom, or which people have a preference towards a specific area of the workplace. How do you create that feedback loop so you make sure that you understand what's really going on and then make things better?
Yeah. I think the interesting thing about, let's say we were to notice patterns in where people sit on the floor, the next step is to say, well, why? If is there some sort of do people tend to cluster? Okay, so Chris is there. Does somebody sort of sit near me, or the opposite? But is it affected by who it is? Maybe that whether they want to be social, or maybe the lights are already on, or is it that there's something inherently good about that location in the office? So I do think we can, and maybe again, maybe it varies by time of day or time of year, and who wants to be blinded by the sun at and I'll just say this out loud. I don't even know if it's politically correct to say blinded by the sun, because is that visually impaired? But so there's my inner narrative. Uh, an aspect of discomfort when talking about invisible disabilities. But anyway, a sunny space is not going to be sunny in 2 hours. So I think you can start to look at patterns, but also keep your eye out for how they vary in time, by day of week, um, time of year. Maybe if you have different offices that have layouts that are comparable, not identical, but comparable, this kind of seating here, maybe near the copier or not, whatever it may be, you can start to look at these trends and but then and then the next step is to dig deeper and say, well, why was this so popular? Maybe it's next to the coffee, uh, and so I do think that's important, especially as you start to think about things like, are we going to open up a second floor today, or should we open up a second floor today? And also, full stop there. What about energy usage? What about CO2 in the air? what are your goals? I mean, in general, it's to reduce space footprint, but only up to a point, right? I mean, given that you're never going to have a perfect fit between number of people and desks because the number of people are variable, and unless you have a really flexible like accordion co-working share thing, you're there's always going to be some gap. I would argue, if in most cases between facilities and number of people, even as we try to right size it. Um, would you pay X 100,000 more a year as a company to have your employees breathing like air with a lower CO2 content, either because you're altruistic or because they're going to perform better or be in better health? So uh, I guess that's the last thing I'll say to sort of contextualize or put a little bit of a check on contextualize the data analysis is to say, well, there are all these things to think about. Um, Not just where people are sitting. That's the beginning, not the end of the analysis.
I think you made an important point there. Obviously, not just where people sit, but where they don't sit. And I would particularly look at the places or the areas where people don't sit. Why is it too hot? Is the air bad? Uh, are the sound levels not comfortable, or is it too much light or too little? I don't know.
Yeah,
But that's I think that's for more for the facilities people to figure out. And I'm not sure is that easy to do without the data and without the technology, because you can't really walk all day, through the offices and just take notes where people are, where people aren't. But if
yeah,
you have the sort of a tool that tells you, occupancy in this area is this, and it's higher or not,
yeah,
then you might figure out. And then we can go all the way to, I don't know, predictive analysis, which tell you, people tend to go away from this area this week rather than last week, and maybe something is happening and you can intervene before it's too late, and the air conditioning
yeah,
system there, just malfunctions or something like that.
yeah,
I think it's a sort of a rabbit hole if you think about it, right? So you start with all the good intentions, and then you get all this data, and there is a myriad of things that you could do. In your opinion, when companies did good or organizations did good, what did they do? What are the success stories you can share?
well, I think part of it, you just said something that reminded me is, I do encourage the analysis of data, even when I'm saying it's difficult and all that. It's I encourage it, but and sometimes you look at it, and even if you can't, it's hard to totally just predict human behavior, or even explain it retrospectively, but you can still get a lot out of it. And so one example that you just reminded me of is, what if you just see like a pattern, a daily pattern that all of a sudden starts changing quickly, where for 1 or 2 days it changed. Something's happening, right? And so I think those are the kind, to go to your question, what are some examples? Is you say, well, something changed. We don't know what the previous state was 100%. We don't know the current state, but we do know that behavior changed these 3 days. And so it's like having the personnel and the dedication as an organization to say, we're going to look into these things in real time as they happen, or maybe the vendor you have does that for you. You still have to listen to it as a company. I think those are where you have this real commitment to observing the behavior and to having some metric. I know a company where they have a goal. We want people to come in when they're hoteling, and we want them to be in their seat within, like, I think it's a minute, maybe it's 90 seconds. And so I think the biggest success stories are people who have goals and measure against those goals. Um, I can't name that company, but it's
I
a
wasn't
large
about to ask.
financial conglomerate.
So just to capitalize a little on that, where should people start? I mean, let's say I'm a company now, and I've just listened to this company to these conversations, or I'm responsible for people's well-being. And
Yeah.
I'm all of a sudden I realized I haven't done a lot. So where should I start?
Yeah. I think you should start somewhere. And I say that I'll give a better answer because don't worry about perfection. Don't worry about being systematic. No one gets there. There are a lot of really complicated facilities management and integrated workforce platforms that have functions that go unused or go used but not really paid attention to. And for whatever reason, maybe it's the systems themselves, maybe it's the lack of commitment or bandwidth to pay attention to them. And so just don't worry about perfection. Start somewhere. And so what I would suggest is it's some data, some concepts. Um, Start thinking about what you would like to know. And if it's, well, I should back up. Operationally, you may decide to do desk booking software because you need it operationally, right? But even before that, you need to somehow understand what's happening and how it compares to what your goals are. Um, but then once, let's say, you start using software, whether it's desk booking or uh, you know, some other employee experience thing, it's just, I think it's committing to pick one or two outcomes and just start to pay attention to them. And it's, I guess my point is just develop the habit of being empirical. And you may end up somewhere really great in 2 years, but don't worry about that end point now. Just take some action, and make
I
sure
like
your
that.
concepts are clear.
I like that because it's not like setting the most important goal and something that's highly unachievable, but do something. I think is
Yeah,
like the best advice, really.
yeah, yeah. And
Start
don't
paying attention, right? So
exactly. And you might have to iterate, and you'll fail a few times. And you have a
sure.
hypothesis. We should measure this. It's going to be really interesting. And then yeah, join the club. You won't find what you think you were going to. Maybe you'll find something else, or maybe you'll move on. Um, Maybe you'll decide to change the furniture out. Maybe you'll realize the chairs in your office are really uncomfortable, and you need to go in with some idea, right, to start digging around, but be open to what you're going to find.
Absolutely. So, Chris, it's been a pleasure, and always when I end up with more questions than I started, I think it was a good conversation, right?
Yeah, and I think you covered so many interesting points, and I think to sum up, kind of where you led the conversation is this is all there. It could be very complicated, but it's also very doable. There are some real first steps. I do workshops where it's just like an hour or two, and it's like just let's start thinking about it and let's orient our minds and establish some shared understandings for people in your company whose main job or expertise is not workplace design or employee experience or invisible disabilities. And those first two steps often can create some momentum if they're done right.
I think I would like to close with that thought that it's doable, and I think that's the key takeaway here. And thank you very much for joining. And looking forward, to speaking again in probably like 6 months or so. See
Yeah,
if what you said earlier still stands, right? Because you mentioned that they change so rapidly. We don't know. Yeah, the truth
yeah.
is that
Well,
we don't know. Yeah.
if it'd be fun if it were just totally embarrassing for me. for
I
me.
don't think it will be. But just
We'll see.
we'll see. We'll see how things go. Thank you very much once again, and yeah, I hope to see you soon on our podcast.
Okay, I had a great time. Thank you.